Hello, welcome to Tennessee's at-home learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for 8th grade students, although anyone is welcome to tune in. This is lesson 8 in this week's series. My name is Mr. Ayers, and I'm an 8th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I am so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lesson, you can find it at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune in to today's lessons if you haven't seen our others. We'll begin today by learning about Emily Dickinson and her poetry. Before we get started, to participate fully in our lesson today, you will need paper, a pencil, and a surface to write on. Okay, let's begin. Today, our goal is to read an informational text, Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1866, in order to understand important details about Dickinson's life that will assist us in understanding her poetry. We will also review the TP-CAST tool for understanding poetry we used in previous lessons. I will guide you in using this tool, and you will practice with one of Dickinson's poems, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. We'll begin with me reading the short informational text, and we will break it down as we go along the way for deeper understanding. At the end of the lesson, I will assign you independent work you can complete after the video ends. Now, let's dig into the first text we will be studying, which again is just a brief introduction to Emily Dickinson's life and work. The title of the informational text is Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1866, which of course indicates her lifespan and that she lived to be approximately 36 years of age. The author is not listed for this text, so we will simply refer to him or her as the author. Are you ready? Great. Let's read the text. Although Emily Dickinson lived much of her adult life as a recluse, which is someone who likes to be alone and is often described as frail or delicate and retiring, which means shy figure, there is a much greater range of depth to the poet in her work than these descriptions suggest. So, just focusing on that first paragraph, what are some inferences that you can make about Emily Dickinson and her work? Take a moment to write some notes down on your paper. All right, let's keep going into paragraph 2 and add to our notes. Emily Dickinson was born to a prominent or famous family in Amherst, Massachusetts. She spent her childhood studying subjects such as botany, which is the study of plants, geology, which is the study of earth, zoology, which is the study of animals, and natural philosophy, which is physical science at Amherst Academy. Add to your notes that you just took. Great. So here's what I inferred so far. It tells us that Dickinson was born from a well-to-do or famous family. This tells me she will have more opportunities and will have a greater likelihood of success than most people. The paragraph also says she spent her childhood studying complex subjects such as botany, geology, zoology, and natural philosophy. This tells me Dickinson's poems will likely draw from a wide variety of academic subjects to inform her ideas. In other words, she will have a lot of ideas in the toolbox to help her creatively write poetry. And then looking back at that first paragraph, notice that we use the words recluse, frail, and retiring to describe Dickinson. What do you think about those words together? What does that tell us about her? So looking at those words together, I wrote in my notes withdrawn, nervous, hesitant. It is a kind of a combination of those words together. Let's keep going. When her formal schooling ended, Dickinson was at an age when young women were expected to take care of the household and engage in social visits with friends and family. But as an independent woman and thinker, Dickinson often questioned the commonly held ideology or set of ideas of the time, including the expectations placed on women and the standard religious views supported by others she knew. So, based on the description of Dickinson in this paragraph, how is her life and work similar to the life and work of a lot of women in today's society? Specifically, how does Dickinson resemble some of the shifts that have occurred in our society regarding the role and expectations of women? Take a moment and write your answer down on your paper. Thank you. It seems she really resembles some of the shifts that have occurred when it comes to the role of women in society. A lot of the traditional roles of women have been heavily changed and challenged and have resulted in a lot of changes in our understanding of the roles. It seems like Dickinson helped in paving the way for this progress. So let's keep reading. In particular, she dismissed the idea of marriage because of the burdens the role of wife placed on a woman. She wanted the freedom to express her own ideas and engage in her own pursuits. So this paragraph gets more specific about the ways Dickinson challenged societal views of women. Based on what we have discussed about poetry this week, why do you think Dickinson was particularly drawn to this type of writing? Write your answer on your paper. Take about 30 seconds. Thank you. Remember, one of the unique aspects of poetry is there are no rules in writing it. For someone who is shy and yet likes to challenge the assumptions of society, poetry is a perfect type of writing. They can write using indirect words, and there are no boundaries for their expression. Poetry is a type of writing that would therefore be very attractive to someone like Dickinson. Let's read the next paragraph. Many of Dickinson's views can be gleaned or gathered from the numerous letters she wrote to her brother, sister-in-law, and friends. Although Dickinson limited her contact with others, she used her correspondence or communication as a way of socializing, and she often shared poems within her letters. In fact, almost all of Dickinson's poetry, around 1,800 poems in all, was either kept private or shared only with family and friends during her lifetime. So take a moment and write down on your paper one important detail or one important inference you made from this paragraph. Great. So, one inference I made from this paragraph is Emily Dickinson loved writing poetry. And it really didn't matter to her whether she would ever be famous for having written so much. Her motivation for writing was not to be famous, but to communicate her thoughts and beliefs in unique ways to her friends and family. This is an interesting contrast to the widespread pursuit of fame today. It is good to be creative, regardless of whether you have a broad audience. Let's read the last paragraph. After Dickinson's death, her family discovered hand-sewn books in which Dickinson had written her poems. It wasn't until years later that the poems were published in their entirety, and Dickinson became known as one of the greatest poets of all time. This paragraph continues the thought of the previous one. It was not until years after her death that all of her poems were published. Her fame arrived after her death. So, now that we have a solid understanding of Dickinson's life and work, let's take a brief look at one of her poems. This poem by Dickinson is called I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. Remember the poem we read called The Fly by William Blake? What is it about poets writing poems about flies? Well, let's find out. We are only going to do an initial read right now of the poem, and then we're going to take a deeper look at it later. So, let's read the poem. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air. Between the heavens or strong winds of storm, the eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for the last onset. When the king be witnessed in the room, I willed my keepsakes, which are items to remember, signed away what portion of me be, assignable, which means transferred. And then it was there interposed, or flew in between a fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and thee, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see. This is a really unique poem that contains layers of meaning. Remember, poetry is communicating meaning both directly and indirectly. It is a difficult genre of literature to analyze, which is why we're going to use the TP-Cast tool to help us do it. Let's refresh our memory of this tool before we dig into the poem deeper. So this tool is called a TP-Cast. Remember that in the TP-Cast, we're looking at the title, we are paraphrasing, we're looking at connotation, attitude and tone, shifts, we're revisiting the title again to look for deeper meaning, and then finally looking at the theme. So on a clean sheet of paper, what I like for you to do is just sketch out 7 sections going down the paper like the one I'm showing you. Don't worry about labeling it yet. We're going to go over each section individually. It doesn't have to look fancy or perfect. Just give yourself enough room to write. Take about 30 seconds to sketch that out. Great. So now let's look at each section. Each of these sections should be completed in a sequential order. The first section is title. Here, remember that your goal is to consider the title of the poem and make a prediction of what the poem is going to be about. Poets are very intentional or purposeful about how they label their poems. There are always very important clues to the poem's meaning in the title, which is why it's a great place to start. For what reasons might the author have chosen the title, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died? Take a moment to jot down your thoughts about the title of this poem. Thank you. In my notes, I wrote down the title, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, is surprising. It immediately makes me ask some questions I hope the poem will answer. First, if you're dead, how can you hear something? And why would that be an important thing to note if you're dying? These are very intriguing or interesting questions the title gives us before we even begin the poem. Okay, so the next section in TPcast is paraphrase. Remember that here the goal is to write down in your words what happens in the poem. Very surface, very literal. You're not really trying to get into the meaning of the poem. This is a simple paraphrase. So take a few moments to paraphrase what you remember from the poem. Thanks. In my notes, I have this paraphrase. When I died, I heard a fly buzz. The stillness in the room was so quiet. Everyone has been crying and is standing around watching and waiting for the death to happen. I already took care of business with signing away my belongings, and now here comes this fly out of nowhere between the light and me. And then everything went dark and I couldn't see anything anymore. Can you see that I kept my paraphrase casual and simple? I am simply trying to capture the literal ideas I find in this poem. Next, let's look at connotation. Remember, connotation means an idea or feeling a word invokes in addition to its literal meaning. Here is where we start to dig a bit deeper. We are looking for a meaning beyond the literal. Poets use a lot of tools to do this, including figurative language, imagery, sound devices, word choice. Remember that some of the most common figurative language devices are simile, metaphor, personification, and symbolism. Did you notice any of these present in the poem as we read it? Let's look through the poem again. Look for any of these elements and take notes on your paper. You're trying to capture just some, the ones that are most important to the understanding of the meaning of the poem. So take about 1 minute to read back through the poem and see if you can find any of those things. So here are some things that I noticed. First, I noticed the frequent use of hyphens to set apart phrases and ideas. You can't see these because I'm reading it orally, but you can hear the pauses when it happens. That's what they're designed to do, is to make the reader pause. So this is a good example of how punctuation can affect the meaning of the poem. Emily Dickinson is known for using hyphens in her poetry. When I read this particular poem and pause at the dashes, it almost feels like I'm watching a movie where the shutter is opening and closing, only allowing me one glimpse at a time. This seems to be parallel the delicate balance between life and death. This is emphasized in that last stanza when she says, between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. I also noticed the figurative use of the term the king is used to describe death. Death, the king is there to be witnessed by those in the room. I wonder what he's king of. Maybe life? There are a number of other things I could have selected, but I think you understand what is being asked for in this section. So let's look at the next section, attitude. In this section, we are trying to figure out the speaker's attitude or tone of the poem. Is it humorous, sarcastic, in awe? Jot some things down on your paper. I wrote down in my notes, suspenseful, amused, and detached. These words all captured elements of the author's attitude in the poem. There is a sense of not knowing what will come next, a sense the author is being lighthearted about things, and the sense that the author is just observing things and not being very emotionally attached. Remember, the tone is an important tool the poet uses to affect how you, as the reader, are interpreting the poem. Now, let's look at the next section, shift. Most poems have a shift, though it may be subtle. Is this moment there's a realization or a change in something? So look for keywords like but, however. You're also looking for punctuation, commas, periods, ellipses, line breaks. And as we look at the text, where do you find a shift? Take a moment and write down on your paper where the shift happens and what you think it means. Great. In my notes, I marked, I think the shift happens when the speaker says, and then it was, there interposed a fly. The speaker, of course, begins by mentioning the fly, but then describes the events before death as if we were there with the others, observing her dying. The shift pulls us back to seeing the room from her eyes and experiencing the last moments before death. Let's look at another section, title revisited. Here we're looking again at the title to see if it's taken new meaning after our deeper analysis. So take a moment to write on your paper any changes from your initial thoughts regarding the title. All right, so I put, after a deeper analysis, I think the title, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, really seemed to capture a lightheartedness to the poem. It's so surprising to hear, and even though the poem describes a scene of death, there is a comic or absurd sense of focusing on the fly and the noise at the time of the death. All right, so now we have our last section, theme. In this section, we are bringing everything together to determine the underlying message of the poem. What does it say about humanity or the world we live in? Take a moment and write down your thoughts on your paper. Thanks. In my notes, I believe this poem is really adding a lightheartedness to the scene of death. Death is inevitable, and we ultimately have little control over it. The speaker paints a familiar scene of grief and even mentions the practical things that happen before we die, such as signing over our belongings. But death itself is ever so brief, and even the simple things can still be noticed in such an important event. Did you find this tool useful? I hope so. I know my students in my regular classroom, this really helps them as they're analyzing and breaking down a poem. But just remember, it's just a tool to help you. So let's take the last couple of minutes to reflect on today's lesson. Today, we learned about Emily Dickinson's life and work and used a handy tool to analyze one of her poems. In the next lesson, we'll use this tool to analyze another one of her poems called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. For your independent work, please respond to the following prompts. Make sure you write these down so you can refer to them later. Number 1, what stood out to you the most regarding Emily Dickinson's life and work? What personalities in society today are similar to Dickinson? Are they positive or negative influences, and why? Number 2, what did you learn the most in our analysis of Dickinson's poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died? What was the most important thing you learned in using the TP-CAST tool to analyze the poem? And number 3, what are your thoughts about this poem? Is it silly or something important to consider? Explain your answer. I have really enjoyed working with you today and analyzing Dickinson poem and learning more about her. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson in Tennessee's At Home Learning Series. Thank you. Goodbye.